I'm so glad to have my friend Dinesh back on the show. Dinesh D'Souza, documentarian extraordinaire, brilliant intellect, host of the Dinesh D'Souza podcast. My friend, good to see you because this is a complicated topic and you are the perfect person to help us unpack it here together.
I have to admit, I'm somewhat of a newcomer to the issue of Bitcoin. However, I have plunged myself into it because the moment I read the original Satoshi paper, I realized that this is something quite revolutionary. So I'm a little late to the revolution, but nevertheless, I think I see the significance of it. As a result, it's something I want to know more and more about and to be part of.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was there sort of on the ground floor initially as it all, but one of the things that I found, especially in throughout my career and going to Fox, where there was a more conservative bent and mentality that really didn't embrace this in the same kind of way that maybe I was willing to on my own, I didn't cover it a lot, and I regret that. And recently, I've been bringing it and introducing it back into the show because I feel very strongly now with this administration that this is going to take off in ways that people can't even anticipate right now. And it's just sort of critical that you have some exposure to it, understand it. I'm not saying it's going up and away forever. I want to be careful and cautious about that. But my sort of sentiment towards it is more bullish than bearish in this environment. But let's back up a moment, because for those of you that are new to Bitcoin, like Dinesh, look, you read the Satoshi paper. It's mind-blowing. And one of the things that I think is hardest of all for people to get over when they initially accept this or come to terms with, okay, maybe I'm going to invest a little bit of money in Bitcoin, is that we don't really know that Satoshi Nakamoto was even a person, right? Like was it a bunch of people? Was it one person? Was it a man or a woman? Was it, really Satoshi? And I think not understanding the fundamental sort of foundation is one of the hurdles that people struggle with, along with the idea that, hey, if it's all just a ruse, could this stuff get hacked? How did you sort of get over that resistance in your own sort of personal discovery of Bitcoin?
Well, let's talk about where the resistance comes from. Now, it comes from, in my case, two things. One is when we are educated into something, in this case, economics, basic economics, you begin to learn more and more, but you don't realize that there are certain root concepts that you take for granted. And there's usually some intuitive reason you take them for granted. So, for example, I took for granted that currencies have got to be uniform within a country, and they have to be controlled by the national government of that country. This is, by the way, partly because that's the way it is all over the world. But second of all, it makes intuitive sense, right? If every individual bank issued its own currency, you'd have to take the Chase Bank dollar and over to Bank of America, and then you'd have to figure out how to trade it for a Bank of America dollar. So the idea of uniformity seems to meet the basic criterion of money, which is that it has to be a medium of exchange. And so if everyone has the same money, it's easier to do that. And so I thought, yeah, it's got to be something that is a United States currency, and obviously who's going to control it if not the US government? So I just took that as an article of faith. I never thought about it. The other thing was in the 1980s, when I kind of cut my teeth politically, the political debate was divided between two camps. The liberal or Keynesian camp, which is basically the government should be able to print money in order to help us out of a recession. The government is basically can use money as a lever to manipulate the economy, create employment, do other things like that. And then there was the conservative or monetarist school, represented by Milton Friedman, which basically said, no, the government needs to be very disciplined and kind of only print as many dollars as matches the growth in the money supply. These were the two camps. But of course, there was a hidden point of agreement between them that I never really thought about, which comes back to my first point, namely, it was Milton Friedman agreed with the Keynesians that we should have a national currency and it should be run by the government. He only disagreed by saying the government shouldn't be so irresponsible and promiscuous, it needs to be self-disciplined. But you know, Trish, as well as I do, that when the government is sitting on a printing machine, the idea of calling on the government to be responsible is absurd. And so, no surprise, in practice, Milton Friedman lost that. He won it intellectually, but he lost it in reality because the government has been doing nothing other than printing money. And so, you know, we always think, all right, well, how do I save myself from this catastrophe, right? Because people always think Bitcoin is volatile. You know, the Bitcoin is a scam. And I'm like, no, our money is a scam. Why? Because, I came, Trish, to the United States in late 1970s with $500 in my pocket, right? $500 that meant everything to me because that's all I got and that's all I had. Let's say that I was extremely disciplined and saved one of those dollars from 1980. I hung on to it. What would that dollar buy me today? Well, the answer is it would be worth something like 20 cents. And so I say to myself, all my effort, deferred gratification, savings, I'm actually proving myself to be a complete sucker because the one thing that I want money to do, namely to preserve its value into the future, it's not doing. I'm being betrayed, and through no fault of my own. I'm being betrayed because other people, our government in particular, through the instrument of the Fed, is continually debasing our money. And again, this is not something that is done through, quote, democratic control. They never asked us about it. Nobody voted on it. The reason that they like to print money, see, if they had to come to us every time they wanted to spend money and say, listen, we need $1 trillion. You know, I'm going to ask you to put up 25,000 of that. People would go nuts. Yeah. So they figured out a better way. And that is, let's devalue everybody's currency secretly and silently by adding more money into the pool, so to speak. It's a horrible thing that these governments have been doing. They've been doing it for a long time. And until very recently, there has been truly no solution to it. So this is the revolutionary aspect of Bitcoin. It comes along, and Satoshi, whoever he is, and I actually think it's really important that we don't know who he is. You know, Debbie and I watched a documentary on, like, who is Satoshi? And this poor documentarian is running around, you know, with Adam Back and all these Bitcoin.
I know. I remember, like, back in the day,
right.
a reporter I knew was, like, tracking down some poor guy, like, that she was convinced was. And I'm like, this poor guy, like, you know, he was like, I can't remember, but he definitely wasn't Satoshi. That's interesting. You think it's important. I get it, right? Like, don't know who he is, because if we did, I don't know. Why don't you know?
Here's why. Because it's not just that the mystique adds to the, you know, the appeal of Bitcoin. It's this. And that is, let's say Elon Musk created Bitcoin, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, who would control Bitcoin? Who would be the Bitcoin numero uno? Elon Musk. And that means we would have to be told to trust Elon Musk more than we trust the U.S. government. Now, in fact, I do trust Elon Musk more than the U.S. government. But nevertheless, the point I want to make is that we don't want to have a global currency that is reliant on the will and authority of one man, a so-called founder. I think Satoshi actually knew this. So that one of the greatest geniuses of Satoshi is not only to create this digital money and make it, in effect, impregnable, make it do all the 5 things that money is supposed to do, but having done it, he knew he had to vanish. He knew he had to sort of, you may say, metaphorically shoot himself in the head, and he did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're fine with that. What about the threat that it could be hacked? I mean, people say that to me all the time, and I get it. But simultaneously, how do I know that my bank account can't get hacked, right? I mean, I think that at some point, like, you have sort of this, you know, suspension of, you just have to kind of go with it. But let me ask you, how have you gotten to the point where you're like, okay, I'm not worried about it being hacked?
The way I think about it is that it is very important that Bitcoin resist hacking, right? In fact, it's more important that Bitcoin resist hacking than, say, Bank of America. And the reason is pretty simple. If I put my money in Bank of America and let's say they get hacked, I'm going to get my money back.
Yeah.
Bank of America is backed by the Federal Reserve. They're going to step in and cover the money. So I kind of feel like the hacking isn't going to sort of take my money away. But in Bitcoin, if somebody could in fact hack your passwords and so on, it would take your money away. So Bitcoin has the higher burden of being able to show that it is not going to be hacked, it cannot be hacked. And I think a large part of the answer is in Satoshi's scheme itself. And that is he's figured out a very clever way to mobilize the best software talent in the world, not only to recruit them, but to incentivize them to protect Bitcoin. And part of the way he does that is by paying them in Bitcoin, so that their own reward of protecting this network becomes obliterated if Bitcoin plunges in value. And so you have, I think in the beginning, Bitcoin was more risky simply because the network was smaller. The sort of software fortress around it was weaker. But with each year, it just gets stronger and stronger. So you now have this kind of global Fort Knox, if you will, for Bitcoin. And it's much better than Fort Knox, right? Because Fort Knox can be targeted, can be blown up in a nuclear strike. It's a physical entity and therefore vulnerable. States can go after it, but states can't go after Bitcoin. Look, if Bitcoin could be hacked right now, the Chinese government would have hacked it, right?
Well,
but it can't be hacked. They've tried to do it. It has never had a single successful penetration in its 15 years of history. It gets stronger by the day. So ultimately, it comes down to, where do you have more confidence that your money is going to be safe? And all I can say is if I look at my dollar, just sort of run a very simple math, right? Just take inflation at 5%. I have a dollar, next year it's 95 cents. Next year it's 90 cents. Next year it's 85 cents. Next year it's 80. It doesn't take too long before it's 50, and it doesn't take too long before it's like 5.
Yeah, no, so savers are punished in this environment for sure. And it's actually a big part of why I keep saying, listen, guys, make sure that you're putting a little money aside every single week. If nothing else, just buy the S&P 500, please, right? Because you want to make sure that you're protected. At least like it's historically over the last 20 years been going up about 10% or so. So at least you're protecting your value that way. Gold, of course, being another, very different than Bitcoin, obviously. But let me ask you as well, like, I think it's okay for me to say, I think you tweeted this out, Dinesh, and I was just stunned. You went through an experience of debanking. I had a crypto CEO on the show the other day, Sam Tabar, who runs a Bitcoin mining company, and also they try to do what Michael Saylor's doing with Bitcoin, where they're taking their proceeds and they're investing it actually into Ethereum, which is kind of a working kind of ledger-like cryptocurrency. But Sam told me he couldn't get a bank account, that he'd been tossed out of his, and this is something that the crypto community came across over and over and over again. Mark Andreessen, who is a noted private equity investor and has helped a lot of these companies along, talked about this with Joe Rogan recently, everybody getting debanked. And it wasn't just the crypto companies, it actually became also political enemies of the Biden administration. Elizabeth Warren is alleged to have been behind a lot of this. They're demanding more information because they want to understand just exactly what went down. But when I think about that, it's actually sort of terrifying, the idea that the US government could come in and just shut off your bank account. And you, sir, you went through some of that. Again, I hope I'm not speaking out of school, but it seems to me all the more reason why individuals would want to find a more secure solution.
Yeah, in my case, it was a single bank, which was Chase Bank. And what happened was, fortunately, it was not the banking system. I wasn't debanked in a consistent way. I essentially, when they closed my account at Chase, I walked across the street, I put the money in another bank, and it was fine. But the reason these things come about is because, to a degree that has, I think, not known by most people, the government completely controls these banks. In other words, it's a combination of the fact that, and when I say the government doesn't act as a single entity. Elizabeth Warren, the SEC, all these people have realized that if you just send a letter to the bank, don't even threaten them. Just say we are very concerned about one of your account holders. Kind of hint that you might be investigating them, and this investigation might lead to some sort of investigation of the bank. The bank will drop that guy like a hot potato. Why? Because what can that guy do? And a lawsuit from that guy is far less scary to them than an investigation by some federal agency that could cost them millions of dollars, subject them to embarrassing public scrutiny. So this is really what's going on. This is what makes it so easy to target people and get them removed from a particular bank or the banking system in general. If you want to get somebody debanked, send the same letter to all the banks that this guy has his account in.
And this is what some of the crypto CEOs ran up against. And Mark Andreessen talked about this because I've seen it. I had done a lot of documentary reporting on the underground marijuana industry when it was sort of coming up. And they had the same problem, right? So if you were running a dispensary, and I'm in no way condoning this, I kind of have a libertarian view on all this stuff, but I was fascinated by this underground sort of current that was going on because you couldn't get a bank account. So literally, the money would stink. Literally, because it was in the dispensary. And then you'd bring it to the bank and they were like, sorry, we can smell that stuff, but also the letters that were coming from the federal government, et cetera. So that was a tension between states and feds. It still exists today. And the same tension is there within the crypto community. The danger, of course, is it goes to political quote unquote enemies of the system as they see it, and anybody who's kind of standing up for something that in any given regime or time that they don't believe in. So I wonder, to a certain extent, is Bitcoin also going to come into a play as a way to sort of rebel against that? And some people are like, oh no, because they'll be able to track every move, it's all digital, etc. And I'm like, yeah, but it's actually not quite the same as the letter to the bank, per se, as you're discussing.
I absolutely do not think Bitcoin has those vulnerabilities at all. Let me put it this way, you don't have to be a libertarian, and I'm libertarian sort of leaning, but hardly a strict libertarian. And here's the point. We believe in a private market, and we live in a free country where, by and large, we have private markets for pretty much all major things, right? The government doesn't tell car companies how many cars to make, or computer companies how many chips to buy. However, we have a complete socialist system when it comes to money, right? The government has monopoly control over money. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not something we ever think of scrutinizing. I've been reading quite a bit of the Austrian economics lately. And part of the genius of the Austrians, people like Friedrich Hayek and von Mises, is they question this assumption. They say, why don't we have a free market in money the same as we do in everything else? What is it that makes money unique? And so this is what got me really thinking about what money is. Because I think part of the reason when I listen to people like Warren Buffett and others, they will say, I think they don't get Bitcoin because they're like, there's nothing there. Buffett will say, if I go and buy a farm, I've got some land, I got some grass, I got some chickens, and I can see the productivity of the farm, and I can value it at the end of the year, like, how's my farm doing? What kind of revenue is it producing? And he goes, well, where do you have those things with Bitcoin? I think this is really the key to the stumbling block. Mm-hmm. Now, the first thing about it is that Bitcoin is different from a farm, not just in that it's digital in the obvious sense. It's different from a farm in that Bitcoin is money, and a farm isn't money. Right. Bitcoin is not trying to be a farm. It's trying to be money. Now, So when you say about Bitcoin, like, where's the intrinsic value, you can extend that to all money. Like, where's the intrinsic value in ancient seashells that were used for money? Where's the intrinsic value even in gold? Gold can be used ornamentally. That's a completely separate market. But where's the value, intrinsic value in a gold bar? There is none. Gold is a stand-in. It's money. Money is just a surrogate for all the work you've done to save, and that is now expressed. The gold bar is nothing more than, you can almost call it a symbol for the money. Once you realize that digital money is no different than any other kind of money, as long as it meets the key features of money. It's scarce, it's hard to make. Ideally, you don't have somebody who has, quote, a printing machine. That was part of the genius of Satoshi, removing himself from the picture. He cannot add more Bitcoin to the pile. and 21 million bitcoins is the end of the
Is the
road.
limit, right? It's like literally there's a finite amount, kind of like gold, although occasionally we discover more gold, but they're not making any more of this stuff. They can't print any more of this stuff. So when it's mined, and it's all mined, that's it. And I think Michael Saylor has pegged that at year 2046, when he believes it's going to be worth 13 million.
I struggle with that, Trish, because when I first heard that, I thought, well, that can never work because economy is growing. Come back to my point about Milton Friedman earlier. I said, if Bitcoin has a finite number of Bitcoin, how does it accommodate a continually growing global economy, right? And one of the things I learned from the Austrians, and it took me a full week to get my head around this concept, is the Austrians said an outrageous statement. They go, when you have an economy, as long as money is divisible, any amount of money is enough.
Yes.
In other words,
yes.
You could take the US economy and the current amount of dollars, don't print a single dollar again ever, and you won't have to. Why? Because as more goods and services are proposed, the money that already exists will simply increase in value.
Yep.
In other words, we'll have the opposite of inflation, we'll have deflation. You'll be able to buy a lot of stuff with a buck, and instead of the dollar buying less and less and less, it will buy more and more and more, and that will be a very good thing.
So you're new to this all. Talk to me about the politics of the moment, because look, China kicked everyone out. They didn't want any Bitcoin miners, and Texas said, hey, come one, come all, which I at the time was like, this is fantastic, because I hear what you're saying, in that money should not have one dominant player, and that look, the U.S. has enjoyed a hegemonic status for ever since, frankly, after World War II. And there's some benefits that go with that. But I also see kind of leading the charge in this Bitcoin space is actually, in the crypto space, is really important, because there's a lot of changes happening right now. And it's sort of arcane when you think about, okay, I can't do anything in the stock market like after 4 o'clock on Friday, right? Like I'm done. Like I gotta wait until 9:30 on Monday morning before I trade my S&P again. And that's sort of, I realize, okay, you got the futures market, you get some after hours market, you got Asia and stuff, but you don't have the same ease. I think, Dinesh, like you fast forward, this could upend the entire financial system, because who needs the CME or the NASDAQ or the NYSE if you could actually create an entirely different exchange based on this digital currency?
This is what the Bitcoiners call hyper-Bitcoinization, when Bitcoin becomes the monetary standard. And while I think is some distance away, I don't think it is outside the realm of possibility. Look, I'm all in favor of if you're going to have a country that has a reserve, it's the global reserve. Obviously, I want it to be us. But it actually encourages us to do very bad things. We have to remember this, and that is that when the government prints money, think about it, they're not only screwing over the population of America, they're exporting the inflation to the rest of the world. They're giving the rest of the world, in a sense, dollars of diminishing value. Remember, because those people are holding the dollars. So it's encouraging our government to behave badly because they've got the cover, so to speak, of being able to diminish the value of everybody's
You can
dollars.
Deflate your way out of debt, right? Like, who cares? We owe China that much. It doesn't matter, because we're just going to keep printing money, and that means we owe them less.
This is exactly the point I'm making. So for this reason, I actually think it would be a good thing to have a neutral global standard. And quite honestly, the genius of Bitcoin is it does not have a serious rival. There are other cryptocurrencies, but they are generally trying to do something else. They're not trying to be money. And moreover, they often have a founder or someone who's controlling it. They have their own Satoshi. And that guy can change the algorithm. He can, that guy has a lot of power over the currency. And so it defeats the point of not having to trust a third party, which is essential, I think, to the significance of Bitcoin. So
you are all in, man.
I find the whole thing just deeply fascinating.
I know, right? Like, okay, we got to do this again. I want you coming back, and we can make this I'm going to put this on the Bitcoin playlist for everyone. And I realize it's a little bit intimidating, but gosh, it's super cool. And I think we're just at the beginning. We're at the cusp of a whole new movement. Dinesh, I'm psyched that you're into it. We're going to talk some more. Thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure.